A philosopher writes a manual on mercy for a teenage emperor. The emperor will become the most infamous tyrant in Roman history. And yet the philosopher's argument that mercy is power's highest expression would echo through Christianity for 2,000 years. Lucius Annaeus Seneca, the Stoic philosopher and Rome's most brilliant prose stylist, wrote De Clementia around 55 AD. His audience was the 17-year-old Emperor Nero, whose tutor and chief advisor Seneca had been since the boy was 11. These were the quinquennium Nerinus, the 5 good years of Nero's reign, when Seneca's influence kept the young emperor on a moderate course. De Clementia is the philosophical foundation of that moderation, a Stoic argument for why absolute power should restrain itself. De Clementia belongs to the genre of the mirror for princes, a guide to virtuous rulership. Seneca opens by holding up a mirror to Nero. I have undertaken to write about clemency, Nero, Caesar, to serve as a kind of mirror for you. The emperor should see himself reflected in the ideal of merciful rule. This genre, the philosophical guide for rulers, would become one of the most important literary forms in Christian political thought, from Augustine to Erasmus. Clemency, Seneca argues, is not the same as pity. Pity is an emotional weakness. The Stoics despised it as an irrational passion. Clemency is a deliberate, rational choice to moderate punishment below what justice would strictly permit. The merciful ruler does not ignore wrongdoing. They punish it, but less severely than they could. Clemency requires power. Only the person with the right to destroy can choose to spare. It is the virtue of the strong, not the weakness of the soft. Seneca frankly acknowledges what others dare not say: the emperor's power is absolute. Roman law, custom, and tradition offer no real check on a determined ruler. The Senate is subservient. The people are powerless. The only restraint on imperial authority is the emperor's own character. This makes clemency not merely a virtue but a political necessity. The tyrant who rules by fear creates enemies who will eventually destroy him. The merciful ruler wins genuine loyalty, the only true security in an age of absolute power. Seneca tells the famous story of Augustus and Cinna. Cinna had conspired to assassinate Augustus, and the emperor was preparing to execute him. But Livia, Augustus' wife, persuaded him to try mercy instead. Augustus confronted Cinna, forgave him, and even appointed him consul. Cinna became one of Augustus' most loyal supporters. The lesson: mercy disarms hatred more effectively than punishment. The conspiracy ended not with blood but with gratitude. Seneca contrasts the merciful ruler with the tyrant. The tyrant kills not from necessity but from pleasure. He punishes to inspire fear, not to correct wrongdoing. He takes life casually as if it were his to dispose of at will. But the tyrant's cruelty is self-defeating. The more he kills, the more enemies he creates. His court is filled with flatterers who despise him. His guards are potential assassins. The tyrant lives in a prison of his own making, surrounded by weapons, trusting no one, sleeping behind locked doors. Cruelty, Seneca argues, is not merely immoral, it is irrational. The cruel ruler harms himself more than his victims because cruelty corrupts the soul. Like an addiction, it escalates. Each act of violence requires a greater one to achieve the same effect. The emperor who begins by executing conspirators ends by executing the innocent. Cruelty is a progressive disease of the mind, and clemency is its only cure. Seneca draws a celebrated analogy from nature. The king bee has a sting but never uses it. Nature gave the ruler of the hive the means of violence but also the instinct for restraint. The king bee governs through presence and authority, not through force. If nature herself teaches that the ruler should be gentle, how much more should a human ruler, endowed with reason, govern through mercy rather than fear? Seneca carefully distinguishes clemency from injustice. The merciful ruler does not let crimes go unpunished. That would be negligence, not virtue. Clemency operates within the framework of justice. It moderates punishment. It does not abolish it. A judge who always acquits is as dangerous as one who always condemns. The wise ruler punishes when necessary, pardons when possible, and always acts from reason rather than passion. Seneca's own position was paradoxical. He preached mercy while serving a regime that maintained power through military force, political murder, and the implicit threat of violence. When Nero eventually turned to tyranny, murdering his mother Agrippina, his wife Octavia, and eventually Seneca himself, the philosopher's arguments for clemency were proven right by their violation. Seneca's death in 65 AD, forced to suicide on Nero's orders, became one of philosophy's most famous martyrdoms. Jerome, the great 4th-century biblical scholar, placed Seneca in his catalogue of Christian saints, De Viris Illustribus, alongside the apostles and church fathers. His justification was a collection of letters supposedly exchanged between Seneca and the Apostle Paul. These letters are almost certainly forgeries, probably composed in the 4th century. But their existence reveals how deeply Christians felt the kinship between Seneca's moral philosophy and their own faith. A Stoic who preached mercy, conscience, and contempt for worldly goods seemed, to Christian eyes, almost one of them. Even before Jerome, Tertullian, the fiery North African theologian of the early 3rd century, had called Seneca Sipe Noster. Often one of ours, Tertullian recognized in Seneca's writings on conscience, moral struggle, and the inner life a voice remarkably compatible with Christian spirituality. The Stoic examination of conscience, the nightly review of the day's moral failures, anticipates the Christian practice of confession. Seneca's emphasis on the internal moral life over against external ritual resonated deeply with early Christian ethics. De Clementia's argument that mercy is the supreme virtue of power profoundly influenced Christian political theology. The Christian ideal of the merciful ruler, the king who imitates God's mercy towards sinners, draws directly on Seneca's framework. When medieval and Renaissance writers composed their own mirrors for princes, they combined Seneca's philosophical arguments with Christian theology. The result was a political ethic in which clemency was not merely advisable but divinely mandated. The forged correspondence between Seneca and Paul was widely believed throughout the Middle Ages. It depicts Seneca praising Paul's elevated thoughts and Paul responding with courteous warmth. Though the letters are crude and obviously inauthentic to modern scholars, they served an important cultural function. They authorized Christians to read and learn from Seneca without guilt. A pagan who corresponded with Paul was safe to study. The forgery created a bridge between Stoic ethics and Christian faith. De Clementia is the ancient world's most sophisticated argument for political mercy. Its influence extends from Ambrose and Augustine through the medieval mirrors for princes to the modern concept of executive clemency. Seneca's central insight that mercy is not weakness but the highest expression of power became woven into the fabric of Western political morality. The irony that a philosopher who counseled mercy was murdered by his own pupil only deepened the text's authority. Seneca lived what he taught. That virtue is its own reward, even when the world does not reward it. Jerome was not wrong to count him among the saints.